He was just a janitor, mopping the floor, until Keanu Reeves looked into his eyes and whispered, "I know you." What happens next unearths a forgotten legacy, a shattered career, and a performance so powerful it once changed Keanu's life. But why was the world allowed to forget him? And why didn't he ever fight back? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The low hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above as Keanu Reeves stepped quietly through the creaky doors of a rundown community theater nestled on a side street in Brooklyn. He wore a baseball cap low over his eyes and a worn denim jacket. Unmistakably ordinary, just the way he wanted it. No paparazzi, no spotlight. Tonight wasn't about him. Inside, the theater smelled faintly of dust, paint, and dreams held together by duct tape. A hand-painted banner above the stage read, "Tonight only, Hamlet's Ghost," starring the rising stars of Fifth Street Players. Keanu smiled softly. One of those rising stars was a young actor named Jake Lennox, a kid he had worked with 2 years ago in a small on-set coaching session. Jake had raw talent, honest eyes, and the kind of nerves that only calmed when the lights came on. Keanu sat quietly in the back row as the performance began. The theater wasn't full, maybe 30 people scattered through the folding seats, but the energy was intimate and alive. The young cast gave their all, each word spoken as if it might be their last time on stage. Keanu watched Jake, pride stirring beneath his still expression. The boy had grown. His voice had depth now, his pacing, his presence. It was real. When the curtain call came, Keanu clapped softly, resisting the urge to stand or make himself known. The applause faded. People began to leave. He waited until most were gone before slipping out of his seat and making his way toward the side entrance that led backstage. He hoped to say a quick hello to Jake. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet congratulations. But backstage was a maze of mismatched doors and narrow corridors. He turned one corner, then another, trying to follow the faded signs that pointed to green room, but something was off. One more turn and he found himself in a dim hallway, lined with old props and cleaning supplies. A janitor's cart sat near a water-stained wall. The smell of bleach hung faintly in the air. And then he saw him. A man in gray janitor overalls moved slowly across the floor, pushing a mop with deliberate, practiced strokes. His posture was straight, despite his age. He didn't hunch like most. Every movement was measured, like choreography. Keanu froze mid-step. There was something oddly graceful about the way the man worked. Not mechanical, not tired. More like rhythm, elegance, the kind that didn't belong in a utility hallway. Keanu watched for a few seconds longer, something stirring in his chest. Then the janitor turned, revealing a lined face, sunken cheeks, and deep-set eyes that carried the weight of years. Their eyes met. Keanu stepped closer, quietly, cautiously. "Excuse me," Keanu said, voice low. "Have we met before?" The man paused. For a moment it seemed like he wasn't going to answer. Then he gave a half shrug, dipping the mop into the bucket. "Used to be someone once," he said softly. "Name's Harlan West." Keanu's breath caught in his throat. That name, that voice. He knew exactly who he was. Keanu stood frozen in the hallway, his mouth slightly open, heart thudding quietly in his chest. He hadn't heard that name in decades. Harlan West. It wasn't a name most people would remember. Not anymore. Not in the world of blockbusters and celebrity hype. But to Keanu, it meant everything. He took a step closer, studying the man more carefully now. Harlan looked older, much older than the last time Keanu had seen his face, even if it was only through a TV screen. His hair was gray, thinning, His hands were calloused. His uniform was stained, the kind that absorbed years without ever letting go. But the voice was the same, low, measured, calm like deep water. You? You were in Monarchs of Dust, Keanu said, almost as if confirming it to himself. That scene, the one with the broken mirror? Harlan didn't look up. That was a long time ago, he said quietly, pushing the mop along the edge of the floor. A very long time. Keanu swallowed hard. His throat had gone dry. I used to watch that scene over and over when I was a teenager, he said. You did something I didn't know was possible. You made pain beautiful. Harlan finally paused, leaning on the mop handle. His eyes lifted to Keanu's, uncertain. You an actor? Keanu gave a faint smile. Yeah, I guess you could say that. Harlan squinted at him now, as if seeing through the hat and beard shadowing Keanu's face. His eyes flickered with recognition, but it was faint, detached. I don't follow the movies much anymore, he said. They don't make them like they used to. Keanu didn't press the point. It didn't matter whether Harlan recognized him. What mattered was that Keanu recognized him, and not just his face. He recognized his silence, his stillness, the dignity wrapped around his every movement. Even now. Where are you here? Keanu asked gently. Working? Like this? Harlan shrugged. Someone's got to mop the floors. Rent's not free. There was no bitterness in his voice, no trace of shame. He spoke as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And that struck Keanu harder than any monologue ever could. He wanted to ask more, but he held back. There was something sacred about the moment. To push too hard now might break it. You were the reason I believed I could act, Keanu said finally. That scene, it saved me. I just wanted you to know. Harlan didn't answer right away. He dipped the mop back into the bucket, wrung it out, and began moving again. As he passed Keanu, he said quietly, almost like a breath, "Then I guess it wasn't for nothing." And he kept mopping, the echoes of his words lingering in the hallway like distant applause. Keanu stood still long after Harlan had disappeared around the corner, his footsteps muffled by the soft drag of the mop. The silence in the corridor pressed in around him, heavy with something more than time. Regret, maybe. Or reverence? He wasn't sure. He slowly turned and walked back the way he came, passing a cracked mirror propped up against a stack of unused folding chairs. For a split second, he saw his reflection. Older now, worn by years of fame, loss, and solitude. And somehow in that sliver of a moment, he felt like the boy again. The boy sitting cross-legged on a cold floor in Toronto, watching Harlan West perform on a flickering VHS screen. The boy who didn't know who he wanted to be, only that he wanted to feel something real. That boy had never imagined he'd one day stand face to face with the man who gave him that first spark of belief. Keanu made it out of the hallway and back to the front of the theater, but Jake was already gone. A few stragglers milled about, picking up playbills or chatting softly. Keanu nodded politely as he exited into the cool Brooklyn air. Outside, the city hummed like it always did, unbothered by forgotten greatness. He walked several blocks in silence before hailing a cab, still replaying the moment over and over. Harlan West. The name hit him like an echo through time. The quiet intensity of that man's performance in Monarchs of Dust had haunted Keanu for years. It wasn't a big film, not a hit, but there was a scene, a single monologue, that etched itself into Keanu's memory forever. A man sitting in front of a shattered mirror, hands trembling as he recited lines about being made of dust and thunder. The vulnerability, the strength, the fragility. That performance had taught Keanu that acting wasn't about pretending, it was about revealing. And now that same man was mopping theater floors with no one watching. No applause, no marquee, just the rhythm of a mop and a voice lost in time. Back in his apartment, Keanu didn't turn on the lights. He sat at his kitchen table, the faint hum of traffic drifting through the window. Then, without thinking, he got up and walked to the hallway closet. It took him a few minutes, but he found it. A cardboard box, worn at the edges, labeled in black marker, "Old Tapes." He pulled out one in particular. The label was faded, but the words were still there. Monarchs of Dust, 1983. Harlan West. He held it in both hands like it might break. And in that quiet room, Keanu whispered to himself, "He was the man who made me believe I could act." Keanu lay awake in bed, the city quiet outside his window. The shadows on the ceiling shifted slowly with the passing headlights below, but sleep never came. His mind was too loud. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Harlan's face. Not the janitor, but the actor. The voice that had moved him long before he knew what fame meant. Before auditions. Before red carpets. Back when all he had was a dream and a rented room in a drafty house in Toronto. He sat up, ran a hand through his hair, and walked barefoot to his hallway closet. He opened the creaking door and pulled out an old box tucked in the back, beneath a stack of unused winter coats. The cardboard was brittle with time, and the tape holding it together had yellowed and curled at the edges. The label was still there. Keanu Reeves, 1980 S VHS. Mistakes. He carried the box to his living room, switched on a dim lamp, and sat cross-legged on the floor just like he used to when he was a kid. Inside the box were faded notebooks, a broken Walkman, and tapes. Lots of tapes. Some had movies he recorded off late-night television. Others were auditions he never sent in. But one stood out. A battered black VHS tape with peeling corners. Written in careful block letters was the title, Monarchs of Dust, 1983, to Harlan West. Keanu picked it up gently, his fingers running over the label as if the film might vanish under his touch. He hadn't watched it in years, maybe decades, but he remembered every frame. In his early teens, he'd found the tape in a second-hand video shop. The store clerk had said it was weird, quiet, and probably boring for a kid. Keanu bought it anyway. That night, he watched it alone in the basement of his mom's house, using an old VCR with crooked tracking lines. He remembered sitting in the dark, wrapped in a blanket, the furnace humming behind him. The movie was slow, almost painfully so. It told the story of a forgotten king, exiled, broken, wandering through a world that no longer remembered his name. And in the middle of that slow unraveling was a single monologue delivered by Harlan West, a shattered man in front of a mirror, talking about power, memory, and dust, about how kings become beggars and how the world never stops to look back. It wasn't just acting. It was like someone had cracked open their soul and spilled it out across the screen. Keanu had watched that scene so many times, he wore out the tape's audio, and that performance, more than any teacher or textbook, had taught him what acting really was. Not performance, but truth. Keanu stood and walked over to the cabinet where he kept a boxy old VHS player, one of the last working ones he owned. He'd kept it for sentimental reasons, never thinking it would be used again. He plugged it into the television, adjusted the input settings, and slid the tape into the machine. The screen flickered. A moment later, the grainy black and white logo of the production company appeared, followed by the soft hiss of static settling into sound. The film began. It wasn't polished. The lighting was harsh, the sets bare, but none of that mattered. From the first frame, Keanu was 16 again, sitting on the cold basement floor, hungry for meaning, searching for something he couldn't name. And then Harlan appeared. He walked into frame like a man half sleeping, half haunted. His shoulders carried weight, not just physical exhaustion, but a kind of spiritual ruin. Every movement was precise, yet weary. Every glance spoke of things left unsaid. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the screen. The room faded away. The years fell off him. In the silence of his modern apartment, he watched that same scene unfold. One he knew by heart, but hadn't truly revisited until now. In the film, Harlan's character, King Delmar, a ruler turned vagabond, sits before a cracked mirror in an abandoned palace. His robes are tattered. His crown lies crooked on a table. He stares at himself and begins to speak. "They used to bow when I entered a room," the character says. "Now the wind barely remembers my name." His voice was hoarse, trembling. Not from fear, but from wear. Like a man who had carried too many memories across too many years. He reached for the crown, then pulled his hand back. "I mistook silence for peace," he continued, "and shadows for loyalty." Keanu's throat tightened. That line had always struck him. Back then, it made him wonder if strength could survive without power. Now, it made him wonder if dignity could survive without recognition. The monologue continued, raw, elegant, unforgiving. Kings fall, not because they lose battles, but because they lose the story. The line echoed in Keanu's apartment. He blinked slowly, eyes burning. On screen, Harlan's character finally looked at his reflection and whispered, "I am dust, but I remember the thunder." The scene ended with him turning away from the mirror and walking out of frame, his footsteps soft, final. Keanu didn't move. The tape kept running, but the rest of the film blurred in his mind. That one scene was enough. It always had been. He reached for the remote, paused the screen where Harlan stood mid-sentence, and just stared. This man wasn't supposed to be cleaning bathrooms. This man had once held thunder in his voice. Keanu sat in the dim light of the room, the frozen image of Harlan West on his screen staring back at him like a ghost. He hadn't meant to cry, but somewhere along the way, tears had started to fall. Quiet, slow, steady. He wiped them away with the back of his hand, but more came. He wasn't crying out of pity, not for Harlan, and not even for himself. It was something deeper. Grief for what had been lost. Anger for how easily the world discarded people who carried brilliance inside them. And guilt, because Keanu had forgotten too. For years, he'd gone from role to role, city to city, film to film. And the tape had stayed in a box, the performance that had made him want to act. Buried under sweaters and notebooks like it was just another memory. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of everything. Keanu pressed play again. Just the monologue. Just those 4 minutes of pure, painful honesty. And as he watched Harlan speak into that cracked mirror once more, he saw something he hadn't seen the first time, or the 10th. He saw a man who never cared about being worshipped, only remembered. Not for glory, but for truth. The tape ended, the screen went blue. Keanu leaned back, his head resting against the wall, eyes red and unfocused. He let the silence fill the room. The hum of the VCR, the soft pulse of the city outside, and the echo of Harlan's final line, "I am dust, but I remember the thunder." He sat there for what felt like an hour, thinking, remembering, feeling. Then he stood, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, set it down untouched. He turned back toward the living room and looked at the frozen tape case on the floor. Monarchs of Dust, Harlan West. He whispered the name again, not because he needed to remember, but because the world needed to. Keanu Reeves didn't make rash decisions. He didn't chase headlines, but in that moment, he knew something had shifted. This couldn't be where the story ended. Not with a mop, not in a hallway no one remembered. Harlan West had given everything he had to his art, and now, without telling anyone, Keanu would give something back. Not with money, not with fame, but with memory, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that lives on in others. Keanu lay awake in bed, the city quiet outside his window. The shadows on the ceiling shifted slowly with the passing headlights below, but sleep never came. His mind was too loud. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Harlan's face. Not the janitor, but the actor. The voice that had moved him long before he knew what fame meant. Before auditions. Before red carpets. Back when all he had was a dream and a rented room in a drafty house in Toronto. He sat up, ran a hand through his hair, and walked barefoot to his hallway closet. He opened the creaking door and pulled out an old box tucked in the back, beneath a stack of unused winter coats. The cardboard was brittle with time, and the tape holding it together had yellowed and curled at the edges. The label was still there. Keanu Reeves, 1980 S. VHS. Mistakes. He carried the box to his living room, switched on a dim lamp, and sat cross-legged on the floor just like he used to when he was a kid. Inside the box were faded notebooks, a broken Walkman, and tapes. Lots of tapes. Some had movies he recorded off late-night television. Others were auditions he never sent in. But one stood out. A battered black VHS tape with peeling corners. Written in careful block letters was the title, Monarchs of Dust, 1983, to Harlan West. Keanu picked it up gently, his fingers running over the label as if the film might vanish under his touch. He hadn't watched it in years, maybe decades, but he remembered every frame. In his early teens, he'd found the tape in a second-hand video shop. The store clerk had said it was weird, quiet, and probably boring for a kid. Keanu bought it anyway. That night, he watched it alone in the basement of his mom's house, using an old VCR with crooked tracking lines. He remembered sitting in the dark, wrapped in a blanket, the furnace humming behind him. The movie was slow, almost painfully so. It told the story of a forgotten king, exiled, broken, wandering through a world that no longer remembered his name. And in the middle of that slow unraveling was a single monologue delivered by Harlan West, a shattered man in front of a mirror, talking about power, memory, and dust, about how kings become beggars and how the world never stops to look back. It wasn't just acting, it was like someone had cracked open their soul and spilled it out across the screen. Keanu had watched that scene so many times, he wore out the tape's audio, and that performance, more than any teacher or textbook, had taught him what acting really was. Not performance, but truth. Keanu stood and walked over to the cabinet where he kept a boxy old VHS player, one of the last working ones he owned. He'd kept it for sentimental reasons, never thinking it would be used again. He plugged it into the television, adjusted the input settings, and slid the tape into the machine. The screen flickered. A moment later, the grainy black and white logo of the production company appeared, followed by the soft hiss of static settling into sound. The film began. It wasn't polished. The lighting was harsh, the sets bare, but none of that mattered. From the first frame, Keanu was 16 again, sitting on the cold basement floor, hungry for meaning, searching for something he couldn't name. And then Harlan appeared. He walked into frame like a man half sleeping, half haunted. His shoulders carried weight, not just physical exhaustion, but a kind of spiritual ruin. Every movement was precise, yet weary. Every glance spoke of things left unsaid. Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the screen. The room faded away. The years fell off him. In the silence of his modern apartment, he watched that same scene unfold. One he knew by heart, but hadn't truly revisited until now. In the film, Harlan's character, King Delmar, a ruler turned vagabond, sits before a cracked mirror in an abandoned palace. His robes are tattered. His crown lies crooked on a table. He stares at himself and begins to speak. "They used to bow when I entered a room," the character says. "Now the wind barely remembers my name." His voice was hoarse, trembling. Not from fear, but from wear. Like a man who had carried too many memories across too many years. He reached for the crown, then pulled his hand back. "I mistook silence for peace," he continued, "and shadows for loyalty." Keanu's throat tightened. That line had always struck him. Back then, it made him wonder if strength could survive without power. Now, it made him wonder if dignity could survive without recognition. The monologue continued, raw, elegant, unforgiving. Kings fall, not because they lose battles, but because they lose the story. The line echoed in Keanu's apartment. He blinked slowly, eyes burning. On screen, Harlan's character finally looked at his reflection and whispered, "I am dust, but I remember the thunder." The scene ended with him turning away from the mirror and walking out of frame, his footsteps soft, final. Keanu didn't move. The tape kept running, but the rest of the film blurred in his mind. That one scene was enough. It always had been. He reached for the remote, paused the screen where Harlan stood mid-sentence, and just stared. This man wasn't supposed to be cleaning bathrooms. This man had once held thunder in his voice. Keanu sat in the dim light of the room, the frozen image of Harlan West on his screen staring back at him like a ghost. He hadn't meant to cry, but somewhere along the way, tears had started to fall. Quiet, slow, steady. He wiped them away with the back of his hand, but more came. He wasn't crying out of pity, not for Harlan, and not even for himself. It was something deeper. Grief for what had been lost. Anger for how easily the world discarded people who carried brilliance inside them. And guilt, because Keanu had forgotten too. For years, he'd gone from role to role, city to city, film to film. And the tape had stayed in a box, the performance that had made him want to act. Buried under sweaters and notebooks like it was just another memory. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of everything. Keanu pressed play again. Just the monologue. Just those 4 minutes of pure, painful honesty. And as he watched Harlan speak into that cracked mirror once more, he saw something he hadn't seen the first time, or the 10th. He saw a man who never cared about being worshipped, only remembered. Not for glory, but for truth. The tape ended, the screen went blue. Keanu leaned back, his head resting against the wall, eyes red and unfocused. He let the silence fill the room. The hum of the VCR, the soft pulse of the city outside, and the echo of Harlan's final line, "I am dust, but I remember the thunder." He sat there for what felt like an hour, thinking, remembering, feeling. Then he stood, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, set it down untouched. He turned back toward the living room and looked at the frozen tape case on the floor. Monarchs of Dust, Harlan West. He whispered the name again, not because he needed to remember, but because the world needed to. Keanu Reeves didn't make rash decisions. He didn't chase headlines, but in that moment, he knew something had shifted. This couldn't be where the story ended. Not with a mop, not in a hallway no one remembered. Harlan West had given everything he had to his art, and now, without telling anyone, Keanu would give something back. Not with money, not with fame, but with memory, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that lives on in others. Keanu wasn't the kind of man who pried into someone's past without cause, but something about Harlan West's quiet dignity, the way he vanished from the spotlight without bitterness, kept pulling at him. He needed to know more, not out of curiosity, but because it felt wrong that the world had allowed someone like Harlan to fade into silence. The next morning, Keanu sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open and coffee gone cold. He typed in Harlan's name. At first, there wasn't much. A few old film credits, mentions in forgotten theater reviews, a grainy photo from 1982 showing Harlan on the red carpet in a deep blue suit, eyes full of light. Another from the early 90s, looking more withdrawn, shoulders hunched. Then, he found it. A single archived article buried deep in an entertainment law blog from 1993. The headline read, "Production halted amid allegations on set of The Obsidian Garden." Keanu scanned the piece. It was vague. During the shooting of the film, an unnamed crew member had made an accusation against Harlan. No criminal charges were filed, no details were confirmed. But the film was quietly shelved, and the studio never worked with him again. The article noted that the matter was settled internally. Keanu dug deeper. Legal records had been sealed. There was no formal conviction, no follow-up press. Just silence. A man erased. He sat back in his chair, anger rising like a tide. It wasn't just the studio that had failed Harlan. It was the industry, the audience, everyone. No one asked questions. No one waited for the truth. They just let him disappear. And what cut deepest was the realization that Harlan had never defended himself. No statement, no rebuttal, just quiet. Keanu closed the laptop and looked out the window, his thoughts racing. He needed to talk to him again, not as a fan, not even as an actor, just as someone who refused to let this story remain buried. That evening, he returned to the little Brooklyn theater. The same smells greeted him: paint, dust, old velvet. He walked the narrow halls until he found the mop bucket again, parked beside a cracked wall. And there was Harlan, kneeling, scrubbing a tile with slow, even strokes. Keanu waited for him to notice. When he did, Harlan sat back on his heels and exhaled, wiping his brow with the sleeve of his shirt. "You again," he said. "I looked you up," Keanu replied, voice steady. "I saw what happened." Harlan didn't flinch. He stood slowly, picked up the mop and leaned on it like a cane. "I figured you would," he said. "Everybody always wants the fall. Nobody wants the quiet." Keanu took a slow step closer, careful not to crowd him. "But the thing is," Keanu said, "there was never a fall. Just silence. Yours." Harlan gave a soft, tired laugh and shook his head. "I didn't have the stomach for the fight," he said. "Lawyers, press, rumors. Even the truth costs more than some of us can pay." Keanu leaned against the wall, folding his arms. "Family buried you?" "No," Harlan replied. "I let them." The two men stood there, one still clinging to disbelief, the other long past it. Harlan's gaze moved down the hall, as if watching ghosts walk past. He didn't sound bitter, just hollow. "I was on set one day," he said quietly, waiting for the next shot. "Someone said something. I corrected them. Not rudely, just honest. They didn't like that. Hours later, I was called into the producer's office." He paused. He said I made someone uncomfortable. No proof, just the accusation. But that was all it took. Studios said they'd pay me out, told me to walk away quietly. I did. Keanu's jaw tightened. "You could have spoken up." "And who would have listened?" Harlan asked. "I wasn't the star. I was just a supporting man with too many monologues and not enough charm." Keanu didn't know what to say. Harlan continued. "By the time I thought about fighting it, the phone stopped ringing. My agent left. My name vanished from the casting boards. A few months later, I was teaching acting at a juvenile hall just outside Sacramento." Keanu's brows lifted. That part he hadn't known. "Prison theater," Harlan said with a faint smile. "Most honest stage I've ever stood on. Those boys didn't care about fame, just about feeling something. Anything." He looked down at his hands, rubbed them together like trying to warm a memory. Bailey cried during Macbeth, laughed during Lear. One of them, Creevy. One of them, Richard. He did Richard III with a stutter, and by the third rehearsal, the stutter was gone, just like that. His smile faded. Mason Rose and me for years. Most of them didn't make it, but a few did. Keanu felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't come here to feel heroic, and Harlan wasn't trying to be tragic. It was just the truth. "I still perform," Harlan said after a pause. Keanu looked at him. "Where?" "Right here, after closing time, every night, to myself." And that was when Keanu knew this wasn't about saving anyone. It was about remembering someone who never needed saving in the first place. Just someone who deserved to be seen. The two men stood there in the quiet corridor, neither rushing to fill the silence. It was the kind of pause that asked for respect. The kind that didn't need performance or pity. Only presence. Keanu finally spoke. "You've still got it. I saw the way you moved the mop, the way you carried yourself. It wasn't cleaning, it was choreography." Harlan let out a soft chuckle. "Decades of rehearsal. I don't know how to move any other way." Keanu nodded. "I don't think you're forgotten. I think the world just stopped looking." Harlan leaned on the mop, his shoulders slightly hunched now. "It's funny," he said. "When I first started acting, all I wanted was to be remembered. I thought if I made them cry once or laugh loud enough, they'd keep me in their hearts. They should have. But I learned something teaching those boys," Harlan continued. "Legacy doesn't live in headlines. It lives in moments, in the people who quietly carry you with them, even if they don't say your name out loud." Keanu swallowed the lump forming in his throat. He understood now. This wasn't a man defeated by circumstance. This was a man who had traded the spotlight for survival and still found a way to be an artist in the shadows. He looked at Harlan again. "I'd like to come back," Keanu said. "Maybe sit in sometime, hear you perform." Harlan raised an eyebrow, amused. "Don't expect curtain calls. I'm not here for a show. I'm here for the story." Harlan gave a small, approving nod. "Come by tomorrow, after midnight. I don't do matinees." With that, he turned and disappeared down the hallway, his mop trailing behind him like a scepter dragged through forgotten halls. Keanu stood there for a while, staring at the empty space Harlan had just left. The silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of everything Harlan had been forced to hold in for so many years. He left the theater that night with no answers, no resolutions, just a purpose. It wasn't to revive a career. It wasn't to clear a name. It was to lift a voice that had never truly gone silent, one that had just been echoing in the wrong rooms. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to open a door, not for the world to see, but for Harlan to speak. The next night, Keanu returned to the theater just before midnight. The street outside was almost silent, save for the occasional rattle of a distant subway or the soft hum of a passing car. He didn't call ahead, didn't knock, didn't make himself known. Just slipped through the side door quietly, the same one he'd exited days before. Inside, the building seemed to breathe in shadows. Stage lights were off, the lobby dark. But Keanu followed the faint glow of an exit sign down the hall, past the green room, past the costume racks, toward the stage. And then he heard it, the soft squeak of rubber soles across wood, the rhythmic splash of mop water, the faint creak of a handle being leaned against the wall. Then, silence. Keanu waited in the darkness. Minutes passed. Then he saw a shape emerge from the wing of the stage. Harlan walked slowly to center stage. No spotlights, no music. Just a dim safety bulb hanging above, casting a low yellow hue like candlelight. He stood for a moment in stillness, breathing. And then he began to speak. To be or not to be, that is the question. Keanu's breath caught. Harlan's voice was low, steady, almost conversational, but it rang through the air like it belonged there, like it had waited all day to be released. There was no theater projection, no forced rhythm, just pure honesty. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. His hands moved only slightly, his face barely shifted, but the weight of every word pressed into the silence like a signature. or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. Keanu stood in the shadows of the wings, watching like a student who had stumbled upon a master class he wasn't meant to see. Harlan's voice grew softer as he reached the lines about death, about dreams. His eyes weren't fixed on a script or the ceiling, but somewhere just past the emptiness, somewhere only he could see. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. The words filled the theater like incense, not with volume, but with depth, with truth, with something ancient and aching. Keanu had seen great actors deliver this monologue on Broadway, in films, on screen with perfect lighting and million-dollar sound, but none of it came close to what he was hearing now. No polish, no pretense, just a man on an empty stage at midnight, asking a question that no one could answer, and meaning it. Keanu didn't move. He didn't dare. Harlan moved through the rest of the monologue with the grace of someone who had lived every syllable. It wasn't a performance. It was confession. It was memory. It was survival spoken in iambic pentameter. He reached the final lines and let them fall from his mouth with deliberate slowness. Soft ye now, the fair Ophelia. Nymph, in thy orisons be all my sins remembered. Then he stood still. No bow, no breathy sigh, just stillness. After a long moment, he turned and began to walk toward stage left, his shoulders square, his steps unhurried. That was when Keanu stepped forward. "Don't stop," he said quietly. Harlan turned, startled. His eyes met Keanu's across the stage. He didn't speak at first, just stared. Then he tilted his head. "You came. I said I would. You were early. I didn't want to miss a second." Harlan raised an eyebrow. "Thought maybe you had better things to do. Blockbusters to film, red carpets to walk." Keanu stepped onto the stage, keeping his voice soft. "I've seen acting. I've done acting. But that wasn't acting. That was truth. That was something else." Harlan leaned on the mop handle he'd left near the side. "I've done it 1,000 times in this empty room, not because anyone was watching, because I couldn't not." He walked slowly to a folding chair at the edge of the stage and sat. The old floor creaked beneath him. Keanu sat a few feet away, cross-legged like a student again. "Where did you start doing this?" Keanu asked. "First time was after the lights went out on the obsidian garden. I came back to the place we'd been rehearsing, found the door still open. Lights were off, but I walked onto the stage anyway, and recited Hamlet." "No," Harlan said. "King Lear. Screamed it, until my voice broke, until I had nothing left." Keanu looked at him. "And it helped?" Harlan nodded. "That night it did. The next night it helped more. I didn't need an audience. I just needed to remember I still had a voice." The quiet stretched between them again. Keanu looked around the dark theater. It felt sacred now, like a chapel. "I wish the world could see this," he said. Harlan gave a faint smile. "The world doesn't need it. I do." Keanu understood. It wasn't about fame or redemption. It was about reclamation. This was Harlan taking back what had been stolen, not from the world, but from himself. And somehow, in the hollow space of a forgotten theater, it felt like the most important performance either of them had ever witnessed. Keanu leaned back slightly, letting the weight of the moment settle into his bones. The air in the theater was still, heavy with something he couldn't quite name. Not grief, not nostalgia, something deeper. Reverence, maybe. "You know," Keanu said, his voice thoughtful, "I've been given awards, accolades, but nothing I've done, not really, feels as alive as what I just saw." Harlan didn't respond right away. He looked at the stage floor, his fingers loosely gripping the edge of the chair. "There was a time I needed applause," he said finally. "The rush, the validation, but the silence. It taught me something. When the clapping stops, all you're left with is the truth, and you either live in it or run from it. Keanu nodded slowly. And you lived in it. I tried. Most days that looked like a classroom, or a prison cafeteria, or a janitor's closet. Didn't matter. If I could say the words, I was still me. They sat together for a while longer, neither in a hurry to leave. Keanu thought about all the nights Harlan must have stood on this empty stage, no eyes on him but the ones in his memory. The courage it must have taken to keep speaking when no one listened, to keep performing when no one applauded. Do you miss it? Keanu asked gently. The stage, the screen. Harlan smiled faintly. I never left it. I just stopped renting space in other people's stories. That line settled deep in Keanu's chest. You've still got something to give, Keanu said, and I think it's time someone gave you the space to do it. Harlan looked over at him. What are you thinking? I'm not sure yet, Keanu replied, but I don't want this to stay hidden anymore. Not for glory, not for revenge, just for legacy. Harlan didn't answer. He simply looked out toward the empty seats and whispered something so soft Keanu barely caught it. Legacy only matters if it plants something in someone else. Keanu stood slowly and extended a hand. Harlan looked at it for a moment, then took it and rose with surprising steadiness. You coming back tomorrow? Harlan asked. If you'll have me. Harlan smiled. Then be on time. The janitor's got a show to run. And as they walked off the stage together, side by side, Keanu glanced over at the mop still resting in the corner. Somehow, it looked less like a tool of labor now, and more like a staff of royalty, waiting to be claimed again. 2 nights later, Keanu arrived at the theater just before midnight again. This time, he carried nothing but a folded piece of paper in his coat pocket. Harlan was already there, finishing his cleaning routine. He didn't speak as Keanu entered, just gave a small nod and returned to scrubbing a stubborn mark near the orchestra pit. Keanu waited until the mop was set aside, and the room was still. I've been thinking, Keanu said. Harlan glanced up from a small stack of programs. Dangerous habit? I want to do something. You're already doing something. No, Keanu said. I mean for you. With you. Harlan looked at him and slowly stood up straight. What kind of something? Keanu took the paper from his pocket and unfolded it. It was a sketch. Not of a plan, but of a stage. A simple drawing of a single spotlight, a chair, and a name written above in bold black ink. A night with Harlan West. Harlan stared at the paper for a long moment. What is this? A one-night event? Keanu said. Just you. No press, no red carpet, no announcements. Just the work. Your words, your stage. Harlan exhaled through his nose, then turned away. No, he said. Keanu wasn't surprised, but he didn't back down. Why not? The world moved on, Harlan said. I'm just a ghost with a mop now. Keanu stepped closer, voice low. Not to me. Harlan chuckled without humor. You think I don't know what this is? Some kind of redemption arc? The forgotten actor dragged into the light for a final bow? No, Keanu said. This isn't about redemption. It's about truth, yours, and making sure it doesn't die in an empty room. Harlan walked to the edge of the stage and looked out over the rows of empty seats. I haven't performed for an audience in over 30 years. You've been performing every night. I've seen it. That's different. That's private. It still counts. Harlan was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned back. Where would it be? Keanu smiled, just a little. I've already got a place in mind. The Broadhurst. They owe me a favor. Harlan's eyebrows rose. That place is old money. It's not meant for ghosts. Keanu stepped forward. Then it's time it remembered what real theater feels like. Harlan looked at the paper again. The chair, The spotlight. His name. Who's going to come? Keanu's voice softened. Anyone who remembers. Anyone who needs to. Harlan said nothing more that night, but he didn't hand the paper back either. The next morning, Keanu sat in a small coffee shop off Bleecker Street with his phone in one hand and a notepad in the other. The paper napkin beneath his espresso was filled with scribbled names, crossed-out dates, and question marks. He wasn't trying to make a spectacle. This wasn't about headlines. It was about reaching the people who still believed that art mattered, that voices like Harlan's should never disappear without a sound. He started with the people who had been around long enough to remember. A retired casting director who once called Harlan the quiet Brando. A stage manager from the Hudson Theater who used to sneak Harlan extra rehearsal time after hours. An actress, now in her 70s, who had once shared a single scene with him in a forgotten indie film and never forgot the way he delivered a line. Keanu called, texted, and in some cases wrote handwritten notes. He didn't lead with his own name. He led with Harlan's. "Do you remember Harlan West?" he would ask. "He's going to do one last performance, one night only. No cameras, just a room, a spotlight, and a chair." The responses came slowly. Some were confused, others stunned, but a few simply said, "Yes, I'll be there." He knew it wouldn't be a full house. That wasn't the point. Even 10 people who truly remembered would be enough. Keanu called in a quiet favor to the Broadhurst's night manager, a man who had worked security during the final run of Death of a Salesman and still held reverence for real actors. He agreed to let them use the space for a single rehearsal and one evening show. "No ads?" the man asked. "None," Keanu replied. "Rest?" "Not invited." The man paused. "Then I guess it's real theater again." Keanu smiled and hung up. He walked the empty aisles of the Broadhurst the next day, imagining Harlan standing center stage, lit by a single golden beam. It felt right. It felt earned. Back in Brooklyn, Keanu returned to the community theater. Harlan was there, of course. Same mop, same hallway. Keanu didn't speak right away. He waited until Harlan noticed him. "Well?" Harlan asked. "We have a stage," Keanu said. "We have a night, and we have people coming." Harlan leaned against the wall, the mop handle resting lightly in his hand. "I haven't memorized anything in years." "Then speak what you already know." "And if I choke?" "Then you choke," Keanu said. "But you do it with your voice, not someone else's silence." Harlan looked away, biting down gently on the inside of his cheek. Then he nodded. "Just once." That evening, Keanu returned to his apartment and sat by the window, the city flickering outside in pulses of amber and blue. He thought about everything that had led to this moment. Not just the discovery of Harlan in that hallway, but the boy he used to be, the one who watched a VHS tape on repeat, searching for something real in a world of pretense. He picked up the phone again and called one more name, Isaac Lerner, a playwright who hadn't published in 20 years, but who once wrote a monologue for Harlan that never got performed. Keanu had found his contact through a mutual friend and left a message. Isaac called back within the hour. "You're telling me Harlan West is performing again?" he asked, incredulous. "Calm night," Keanu said. "No audience larger than 50, no filming, no scripts, just him. And maybe your words." Silence on the line. Then Isaac said, "He made me want to write. I'll be there." The pieces began to fall into place, not perfectly, not quickly, but honestly, like building something out of memory instead of blueprints. The next night, Keanu met Harlan at the Broadhurst for a walkthrough. The old theater was quiet. Dust danced in the light coming through the high windows. The stage creaked beneath their steps. Harlan looked around like a man walking through a memory he never expected to see again. He stepped to center stage and stood there, his eyes scanning the rows of velvet seats. "I used to dream of places like this," he said softly. "Not for the size, for the silence between breaths. The way it listens to you. Keanu handed him a folded sheet of paper. Isaac's monologue. Harlan opened it. Read the first few lines, then smiled without showing his teeth. Give me 2 days, he said. Keanu nodded. He stepped off the stage, letting Harlan be alone in the space for a while. It wasn't rehearsal. It was reunion. Back in the wings, Keanu sat down and listened. Not to words, but to the rhythm of footsteps. To the deep inhale of a man touching something sacred again. He didn't need to direct. He didn't need to plan. He just needed to make space. And that, he realized, was the truest kind of tribute. 2 days from now, people would come, not because a movie star invited them, but because an old echo had finally found its voice again, and this time, someone would be listening. The first night of rehearsal came quietly. No fanfare, no script readings or warm-ups, just 2 men in an empty theater with nothing between them but time and memory. Keanu arrived early and sat in the second row, watching as Harlan stood center stage under a single house light. He wasn't holding any pages. Everything he needed was already inside him. He closed his eyes for a moment, then began speaking. Not Isaac's new monologue, not Hamlet, but something deeper, familiar. Keanu recognized it halfway through the first line. It was Gloucester from King Lear. I stumbled when I saw. Harlan's voice cracked, not from weakness, but from control, choosing to let the pain through in precisely the right places. He moved slowly across the stage, not performing for anyone but himself. But Keanu watched, like a student who'd waited a lifetime to be in that room. You cannot see your way, Harlan whispered, but you can smell your way to Dover. The words floated across the seats and landed on Keanu's chest like bricks. He remembered watching a recording of this scene in his 20s. Not this version. This was sharper, heavier, weathered by time. This was not the Gloucester of textbooks. This was the Gloucester of survival. After a pause, Harlan turned and looked directly at Keanu. You remember it? He asked. Keanu stood up, moved closer to the stage, and climbed the steps slowly. Not like that. Harlan gave him a small smile. You want to try a scene? Keanu nodded. What do you have in mind? Let's do the cell scene from Measure for Measure. The Duke and Claudio. You'll be the prisoner. Keanu blinked, surprised. That's a reversal? That's the point, Harlan said. Let's see if you can find something you haven't touched yet. They began without introduction. Harlan transformed instantly, shoulders back, voice stern but alive. Keanu responded, stumbling at first, then settling into rhythm. He matched the words, then the emotion, then the silence between the lines. And in that strange, dusty theater with no crew, no audience, and no lighting cues, something happened. The air changed. It was rehearsal, yes. But it was also something sacred, a transmission between generations, between artist and admirer, between the man who taught without knowing it and the one who never forgot. They finished the scene and stood in silence. Keanu broke it first. I haven't felt like this in a long time. Harlan turned, breathing a little heavier than before. That's because you stopped asking why. Keanu didn't reply. He didn't need to. They rehearsed again, this time with Isaac's monologue, then again with Harlan's own piece. Hours passed. The theater stayed quiet except for their voices, bouncing gently between the walls. Later that night, they took a break. Harlan sat on the edge of the stage with his legs hanging over the side, sipping water from an old thermos. Keanu sat nearby, arms resting on his knees, quietly watching the way Harlan's chest rose and fell, steady and strong despite the hour. You ever teach? Keanu asked. Harlan nodded. For years, after the work dried up. Didn't have a resume anyone wanted, but I had a voice and a way of helping people find theirs. Keanu leaned forward. What was it like? Teaching in prisons. Harlan looked out over the empty seats. They were honest. That's what I remember most. Those boys didn't care how you looked. They didn't fake applause. They listened, because every story was a way out of their own. He set the thermos down and rubbed the back of his neck. I taught Shakespeare, yes, but not like textbooks. We broke it apart, made it ours. One of my students, he had a speech impediment, took on Macbeth like it was written for him. Every word was a mountain, and he climbed them all. Keanu smiled softly. What happened to him? Transferred, Harlan said. System moves fast when it doesn't care. But the last thing he told me was, "You made me forget where I was for 5 minutes." That's theater. Keanu nodded slowly. That's everything. Harlan looked over at him. You know, I used to be proud of the big roles, the critics. But those nights in the chapel room, with broken chairs and echoey voices, I think that's where I gave my best. Keanu studied him for a moment, then stood. Show me one of those pieces, he said. Harlan raised an eyebrow. You sure? Want to see what they saw? Harlan rose to his feet and walked slowly to center stage. He didn't warm up, didn't stretch. He simply took a breath and began. It was a monologue Keanu didn't recognize. Not Shakespeare. Not Isaac. Maybe something Harlan had written himself. The words were rough, poetic, raw. A story about a man who spent his life mopping up the messes of others, only to discover he'd left his own life untouched. Every line hit like a quiet hammer. There was no act in it, just pain and pride, and the kind of truth that couldn't be taught, only survived. When it ended, Harlan didn't bow. He just stepped back and looked at Keanu. Keanu stood, frozen, jaw tight. I don't have words, he said. Good, Harlan replied. That means I found mine. They ran one last scene that night. Something familiar, something ancient. Harlan chose the storm speech from King Lear. Keanu didn't interrupt or participate. He didn't even sit. He stood behind the curtain, listening as the words filled the dark again. Blow, whines, and crack your cheeks. Rage, blow. Harlan's voice was thunder and gravel. It boomed through the empty house, rising and falling like a man daring the sky to strike him down. He paced across the stage, arms flaring, then collapsing into stillness. Every word landed with weight, not for effect, for memory, for meaning. That's not my flesh and blood. That is not Lear. Keanu pressed a hand against the wall, steadying himself. The pain in the words was real. It echoed the shame of being cast aside, the betrayal of being forgotten. And somehow, it felt like Harlan wasn't just reciting lines anymore. He was reclaiming something. By the time the monologue ended, the theater was still. Keanu walked onto the stage slowly. Harlan didn't look at him. He just stood there, breathing hard, eyes forward. Keanu didn't say anything right away. He didn't need to. Eventually, he stepped beside him and said softly, "You're ready." Harlan exhaled, finally letting the tension in his shoulders drop. I didn't think I'd ever say those words again, he admitted. You didn't forget them. I couldn't, Harlan said. They're carved into me. They gathered their things quietly, folding up scripts, switching off lights. The air still carried the pulse of everything they'd rehearsed, scenes layered with grief and fire, humility and rage. At the door, Keanu turned back for one last look at the stage. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like something sacred had returned. As they stepped out into the quiet night, Keanu looked over at Harlan. You know what I think the audience will feel? Harlan shook his head, like they just remembered something they never knew they lost. Harlan chuckled under his breath. Let's hope they don't fall asleep halfway through. Keanu smiled. I doubt they'll even blink. They walked together in silence through the still streets, side by side beneath the flicker of old lamplight. For Keanu, it was a return to where it began. For Harlan, it was the first step back to where he belonged. The Broadhurst Theater had never felt this, still. There were no velvet ropes outside, no paparazzi, no marquee glowing with names, just a handwritten placard at the door with 4 words, "A Night with Harlan West." Inside, the seats filled slowly. Familiar faces from long ago took their places in near silence. A retired Broadway director, a young playwright who had once studied Harlan's pacing through grainy clips, a costume designer who hadn't been on a stage in 15 years, and among them a few curious strangers, drawn by word of mouth, by mystery, by the quiet buzz that something rare was about to happen. Keanu stood near the entrance, welcoming people with a small nod or a quiet handshake. No interviews, no photos, just presence. He moved without drawing attention, but everyone who passed seemed to know this night existed because of him. He took his seat near the back, second row from the end. No spotlight, no center aisle, just one man watching another reclaim his name. The lights dimmed. No announcements, no overture, just a single spotlight blooming onto the stage. And then Harlan West walked out. He wore a simple black shirt and gray slacks. No costume, no prop, just a folded paper in one hand and the weight of a lifetime in the other. He moved slowly but with purpose, like each step was chosen. He stopped at center stage, looked out at the crowd, and waited until the room stopped breathing. Then he spoke. Bailey said, "I disappeared." The words rang out, soft but clear. But I was only ever quiet. A pause. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was reverent. "I played kings once," Harlan continued, unfolding the paper gently. "But I was never crowned." There was no shuffle in the audience, no cough, no rustle of jackets or shifting seats, just the pure electric charge of stillness. I wandered palaces made of plywood, wore robes stitched by angels who worked part-time jobs. I stood under lights that burned too hot and said words that weren't mine, but I meant every one of them. He looked up from the page. And when the world stopped asking for those words, I kept saying them anyway. In storage rooms, in prison cafeterias, in borrowed hallways with bad acoustics, a murmur of emotion passed through the room. But no one moved. Harlan folded the paper again and held it at his side. "I'm not here to be remembered. I'm here to remember who I am." Then he stepped forward, just one small step, into the center of the light, and began. Harlan began the monologue not with grandeur, but with restraint. His voice came low at first, intimate, like he was speaking to a single person rather than a crowd. The piece wasn't Shakespeare. It wasn't Isaac's script either. It was something else, something entirely his. A monologue built from years in the shadows, shaped by loss, memory, and survival. "I used to think applause was proof," he said, "proof that I mattered, but applause fades, echoes die, and what you're left with are the words that never needed anyone to clap for them." He took a step forward. The spotlight followed. "I was 20 when I first played a man twice my age. They said I had old eyes. I didn't understand what that meant until I watched everything I loved get smaller." His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't flinch. He leaned into the line. "The truth is, I stopped performing long before I left the stage, not out of choice, but out of silence, the kind of silence that follows you even when the room is full." A woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Harlan continued, his tone deepening. "There's a moment every actor fears, when the character disappears and the mirror shows only yourself. No script, no mask, just you. And if you're lucky, what you see isn't hollow." He looked out at the crowd, not above them, not beyond them, but into them. And the room leaned in without a sound. "I played kings once," he said again, slower now, "but I was never crowned, because crowns don't come with truth. They come with noise, and I chose the quiet." From the back row, Keanu sat motionless, his hands clasped. He could feel it rising in the room, emotion like a wave, but not dramatic. It was honest, grounded, earned. Harlan's pace slowed, his voice dropping. I mopped floors with the same hands that once held daggers and scepters. Not because I fell, but because I stayed. He paused again. You call it obscurity, I call it peace. Then, with a long breath, he said the final line. I did not vanish. I became still, and in the stillness, I remembered my name. The room held its breath. Harlan didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply stepped back, letting the light fall away from his face. No music followed. No announcement. Just silence. And then one person clapped. Softly. Then another. And another. Until the entire theater was on its feet. The applause didn't crash like thunder. It rose like a tide. Gentle at first. Then steady. Then full. Not a celebration, a recognition. A room of strangers, peers, and forgotten friends, standing not because they were told to, but because they knew they'd witnessed something rare, something honest. Harlan didn't react right away. He stood still, letting the sound wash over him, face calm, chest rising and falling. It wasn't pride in his eyes. It was peace. A quiet acceptance that the voice he had carried in silence for so long had finally been heard. Keanu remained in the back, not clapping yet. He just watched. There was no need to insert himself into the moment. This wasn't his story. This was Harlan's, and Harlan had told it without needing anything more than a stage and his truth. When Harlan stepped down from the platform, the lights gently faded. There was no curtain, no music cue. Just an exhale from the crowd as they slowly began to sit back down, some still wiping their eyes, others simply sitting in silence, not ready to move. A few minutes later, Keanu walked slowly toward the stage. He found Harlan near the wings, sitting on a wooden crate with a towel over his shoulders, sipping water like a boxer between rounds. His hands were shaking, just slightly. Keanu didn't speak at first. He just sat beside him. Harlan broke the silence. Wasn't sure I could get through it. Keanu shook his head. You didn't get through it. You carried it. Harlan chuckled, low and tired. Felt like a storm passing through me. That's what truth feels like when you let it breathe. Harlan looked over at him. How did it land? Keanu turned his head, looking out toward the empty stage, then back to him. Ably heard you. Every word. For a long moment, neither said anything. Then, softly, Keanu added, You did more than perform. You returned. Harlan leaned back, resting his head against the backstage wall, eyes half closed. Maybe that's all any of us really want. To return to something that felt like ours. Keanu nodded. You took it back tonight. As the theater emptied, a few guests remained quietly in the lobby. Some were talking in hushed voices. Others stood alone, still holding on to what they'd just experienced. Keanu helped Harlan to his feet. No cameras followed them, no agents, no noise. Just the echo of something remembered. And for the first time in decades, Harlan West didn't feel like a name from a forgotten credit roll. He felt whole. The room stayed full. After Harlan stepped off stage, the lights didn't come up. No music played. Instead, a quiet breath seemed to pass through the audience, like they all knew this night had more to give. There was no MC, no prompt, just the presence of something waiting. And then, from the wings, Harlan stepped out again. He walked slowly back into the spotlight and stood silently for a moment. This next piece, he said, isn't Shakespeare, and it's not mine alone. It belongs to everyone who's ever been erased. No one moved. Harlan began. The first monologue was from a forgotten one-act play, written by a woman who'd died in obscurity but had once handed him a copy at a park bench. The scene was short, 2 minutes at most, but full of ache. A man speaking to a coat left on a hanger, pretending his wife was still in the room. The way Harlan delivered the lines, gentle, then aching, then barely audible, made the room lean in so tightly it felt like they were holding their breath. He didn't pause afterward. He moved into the second piece without introduction. It was a wartime letter, read aloud from memory, a father speaking to a son he never met. The lighting dimmed slightly, though no one touched the controls. Harlan spoke the letter with his hands trembling slightly, as if he were the writer himself. I never held you, never heard your voice, but I know your face. I see it in every mirror I've passed in shame. The audience didn't sob yet, but eyes welled. Then came the third piece. It was something they recognized. Now is the winter of our discontent. He recited it slowly, not with Shakespearean flair, but with the kind of exhaustion that makes great men human. His Richard III wasn't twisted and theatrical. He was worn down, brittle, still scheming, but now at the edge of his own despair. Harlan reached the final lines, paused, and then looked directly at the front row. And thus I clothe my naked villainy with old odd ends stolen out of Holy Writ. He let the silence sit for several seconds. And then, just before the room could exhale, he spoke again, quietly, with purpose. There's one more. He turned and reached behind the curtain, pulling out a small wooden chair. Old, scraped, plain. He set it down at center stage. This, he said, I wrote in the chapel room of a correctional facility outside Sacramento. They gave me 30 minutes of silence and a pencil. I called it the janitor's chair. And then, with no further introduction, he sat down. Harlan sat on the wooden chair like it was a throne carved from memory. He let the silence settle around him, the kind of silence not born of emptiness, but of listening. Then, in a low, steady voice, he began, I clean what you forget. That first line didn't land like poetry. It landed like truth. I see what you throw away. I carry it in plastic bags that split at the seams. I mop up your footprints, your spills, your shame. I am not thanked. The audience was still, frozen in place. Harlan's voice softened. Every night, I perform, not on your stage, but around it. I rearrange your illusions. I set your props. I polish your exits. His eyes looked upward now, but not toward the lights, toward some invisible balcony, like he was speaking to someone who never clapped. You think I don't know art? I've been in the wings longer than most actors live. I've heard the lines from behind closed doors. I've whispered them into empty halls. Not to be remembered, but to remember that I still could. A woman near the center of the audience let out a soft cry. Someone handed her a tissue. She shook her head, eyes wide, refusing to look away. I was an actor once, Harlan said, before they rewrote the script and handed me the broom. Before the lights went out. Before I became part of the scenery. He paused, then stood slowly, the wooden chair creaking beneath him. But I never stopped performing. He walked forward. Every mop stroke was a rhythm, every hallway a stage, every echo of my voice in an empty bathroom stall. Applause. A small child whispered near the aisle, just loud enough to be heard by those nearby. Is he real? Harlan heard it. He didn't smile, but he looked toward the voice and gave the slightest nod. Then, turning back to the crowd, he delivered the closing lines. Art doesn't die when you stop watching. It dies when the artist stops speaking. And I never stopped. He picked up the chair gently and carried it to the side of the stage, setting it down with reverence. Not as a prop, as a piece of himself. Then he returned to center, looked at the audience for the last time, and bowed. No flourish, no final line, just a bow. And then Harlan West turned and walked off stage. The room did not erupt. It didn't need to. It held him in something quieter than applause. It held him in remembrance. Backstage, the only sound was the slow, even breath of Harlan West as he leaned against the wall, eyes closed. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The performance was still alive inside him, moving like a quiet current beneath the surface. Keanu waited at a respectful distance, arms folded, eyes fixed on the curtain that still swayed slightly from Harlan's exit. The stage was dark now, the spotlight gone, but the weight of what had just happened remained heavy in the air. Out in the house, the audience hadn't moved. They sat motionless, as if breaking the silence would somehow undo the spell. A few people wiped their faces. Others simply held their hands clasped in their laps, unsure of what to do with them. It was the kind of quiet that didn't ask for more. It asked for reflection. Then, without signal or sound, the crowd began to rise. One by one. No cheers, no chants, just people standing. A gesture more powerful than any ovation. From the second row, a woman clutched her chest, quietly mouthing the words, "Thank you." The man near the back removed his hat and held it against his chest. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, stood on her chair and looked around in awe, then turned to the woman beside her and whispered, "He looked like he meant it." The woman nodded. He did. Behind the curtain, Harlan finally opened his eyes. He turned to Keanu, who was still watching him, barely breathing. "That's it," Harlan said quietly. Keanu stepped forward, voice soft. "That's enough." Harlan's hands trembled slightly, but not from fear, from release. "Do you think they understood?" he asked. Keanu didn't hesitate. They didn't just understand, they felt it. Harlan looked down at the floor, nodded once, then slowly pulled off the black shirt he had performed in and folded it carefully. From the shadows, the stagehand who had watched silently all evening approached and held out a worn paper program. One of the old handbills from Harlan's last credited performance in the early 90s. "I kept this," he said. "Didn't even know why, until now." Harlan accepted it with both hands, his voice catching. "Thank you." He slipped it into his coat pocket without another word. As the audience began to quietly file out of the theater, Keanu peeked out from the side curtain and saw something unexpected. No one was speaking. Not loudly, not idly. They left like people who had witnessed something they weren't quite ready to explain. Not a show, a reckoning. He turned back to Harlan. "You gave them something real tonight." Harlan nodded once, slowly. "No," he said, "they gave me something." Then, without waiting for a reply, he walked down the narrow hall, past the curtain, past the echoes, and into the night. No longer a ghost. The lobby of the Broadhurst was quiet, filled with the soft sound of footsteps and whispers. There was no buzz, no selfies, no lines for autographs. Only a slow-moving line of people, forming without instruction, waiting to speak with the man who had just poured decades of silence into a single night. Harlan stood near the old velvet curtain, still dressed in his gray slacks, his stage shirt draped over one arm. A small table beside him held a pitcher of water and a stack of folded programs from the evening. Unlabeled, unbranded, just the words, "A Night with Harlan West," printed in plain black font. The first to approach was a woman in her 60s, who had once been an assistant costume designer during Harlan's short-lived television stint. She hadn't seen him in over 30 years. Her voice trembled as she said, "You remembered things I thought I'd forgotten." Harlan smiled gently and thanked her, holding her hand a moment longer than most would. Next came a young playwright who had never met Harlan but had studied him like myth. He offered no words, only a quiet nod and a single folded page from his journal. Notes he'd taken during the performance. There were others, a retired lighting technician, a former cellmate's niece, a man who had seen Monarchs of Dust at a midnight screening in 1987 and never let go of the memory. Each person brought something small, not gifts, but acknowledgments. symbols that Harlan's voice had reached them not just tonight, but across time. Keanu stood off to the side, his presence unnoticed by many. He didn't need attention. His eyes remained fixed on Harlan, watching every interaction, every whispered thank you, every lingering pause. He had never seen a man more present. Then the line shifted. A little girl appeared at the front, maybe 9 years old. She was holding something in both hands, tightly. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid, and she wore a red hoodie 2 sizes too big. She stepped forward, clutching a folded piece of paper with creases worn from how tightly she'd held it. Her voice was clear, despite the room's hush. "My name is Lila," she said. Harlan knelt down without hesitation, lowering himself to her height. She held out the paper. "I made this while you were talking." He opened it carefully. It was a sketch, rough, sweet, full of life. It showed a man sitting in a chair under a beam of light. Around him were empty rows, but above him, drawn in blue pencil, were words. "He never stopped." Harlan's eyes shimmered. "Is that me?" Lila nodded. "My dad cried when you talked. I think I want to be an actor now." Harlan held the drawing as if it were made of glass. His hands, worn from years of labor, trembled slightly as he studied each detail. The lines weren't perfect, but the emotion was. The spotlight, the chair, the way she'd drawn his hands on his knees, just like he had sat during the janitor's chair. He looked back at Lila, her small face open and serious. "You think you want to be an actor now?" he asked, his voice low and full. She nodded, her voice steady. "I didn't know before, but when you talked, I felt like I could say something too, like maybe someone would listen." Harlan blinked, hard. Then he smiled, not the smile of someone performing, but of someone seen. He gently reached out and touched her shoulder. "Then you already are one." Her eyes widened, not in disbelief, but in the quiet thrill of being believed. Keanu, standing only a few feet away now, felt his throat tighten. He turned slightly, wiped the corner of one eye with his thumb. There had been countless powerful moments in his life, on film sets, on stage, with fans, but this small exchange between a crumpled legend and a child with a crumpled drawing, this was something else. It was legacy in motion. Lila's father stepped forward, his own eyes red. "Thank you, Mr. West," he said, his voice cracking. "I haven't seen my daughter sit still for more than 10 minutes in months. Tonight she didn't move." Harlan nodded humbly. "Thank you for letting her listen." Lila hugged him without asking. He wrapped his arms around her, gently, like he was afraid she might vanish. When she stepped away, she looked up once more. "Will you be in another play?" Harlan paused, then smiled faintly. "That depends. Will you be in it with me?" She giggled and gave a shy nod before her father guided her away. As they walked off, Harlan remained kneeling a moment longer, the sketch still in his hands. When he rose, he turned to Keanu. "I don't know what I expected tonight to be," he said, "but I didn't expect that." Keanu nodded, eyes still glassy. "You gave her more than a story. You gave her a beginning." Harlan looked down at the drawing again, then carefully folded it and placed it in his coat pocket. "I used to think my words ended when the curtain closed," he said softly, "but maybe they're just getting started." Keanu placed a hand gently on Harlan's back. "They are." The line had dwindled, but the feeling in the room hadn't faded. People were still talking in quiet voices. Some stayed just to be near what had happened, even if they couldn't explain it. Something had shifted, and it wasn't going back. The theater began to empty, but no one truly left, not in spirit. They lingered at the edges, reluctant to break the spell that had settled over the night. A few guests offered quiet thanks to Keanu, but most eyes remained on Harlan. He had become something more than a man who once performed. He had become a mirror, reflecting loss, dignity, and forgotten courage. Keanu stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. They didn't speak for a moment. It was enough to just be there. Eventually, Harlan broke the silence. "You ever feel like a moment is too big for your body?" he asked. Keanu nodded. "All the time. That's how I know it's real." Harlan looked at the sketch in his hand again and let out a quiet breath. "I used to think applause was the end of the sentence, but I was wrong. This," he held up the drawing, "this is the beginning of a whole new story." They moved slowly toward the exit, where the night air waited. Harlan stepped outside first, the city's breath cool against his face. Across the street, someone had left flowers on the steps. No note, just petals gently falling with the breeze. Keanu followed, eyes scanning the block. It looked like any other night in New York. But it wasn't. Not for them. Not for her. Harlan turned to him. "Do you think she'll really remember this night?" Keanu nodded. "I think she'll tell the story for the rest of her life. And when she's older, she won't just remember what you said. She'll remember how it made her feel." Harlan smiled, smaller this time. Quieter. "Then maybe I did my part." "You did more than your part," Keanu said. "You reminded all of us why we ever cared about acting in the first place." They stood together at the edge of the sidewalk for a while, neither in a hurry to leave. The lights inside the theater had finally gone dark, but the glow they left behind still clung to every corner of the building. A cab rolled by, slowing briefly, but Keanu waved it off. This wasn't a night for rushing. Finally, Harlan spoke again. "Funny thing is, I don't feel like I came back." Keanu looked at him. "You didn't." Harlan raised an eyebrow. "You arrived," Keanu said. "Maybe for the first time." Harlan chuckled under his breath, then reached into his coat and touched the folded paper tucked safely inside. "I'm keeping this sketch forever." "I know." Then they turned and walked down the block together, one step at a time. A man remembered, a girl inspired, and a story still unfolding. The next morning was gray and quiet, the kind of day that didn't make headlines. Keanu arrived at Harlan's apartment just before 9, a coffee in each hand. He knocked once and waited. The door opened slowly, and there stood Harlan, already dressed, coat folded neatly over one arm. "No cameras?" he asked. Keanu handed him a coffee. "Just memories." They took the subway together, sitting in silence most of the ride. Harlan held the sketch from Lila in his coat pocket. He didn't speak of it, but every now and then he touched it gently, as if checking to make sure it was still there. They got off in Midtown, near where the old Uptown Cinema used to stand. The last time Harlan had walked this street, he was on the edge of something. Maybe fame, maybe collapse. The film Monarchs of Dust had opened here for a short run before being pulled. It wasn't the film's fault. It was the whispers around the name printed beneath the title. His name. Now, decades later, the marquee was gone. In its place stood a pawn shop with metal grates over the windows. A cracked neon sign blinked half-heartedly. "Buy, sell, trade." Harlan stopped in front of the building. His eyes scanned the faded bricks and boarded side entrance. For a moment it looked like he might speak, but he didn't. Keanu stood beside him. "This is where I saw you for the first time," he said. "I was 16. Snuck in with a fake ID and a head full of dreams." Harlan gave a quiet laugh. "You should have asked for your money back." "No," Keanu said. "That night changed everything." They walked slowly past the shop, Harlan's pace deliberate, careful. A gust of wind pulled at his coat. "I used to wonder if I should have done more to fight back," Harlan said, "to prove I was worth remembering." Keanu looked at him. "You didn't need redemption, just remembrance." Harlan nodded. "Funny thing is, I don't even miss the roles. I miss the feeling that what I said mattered." "It still does," Keanu said. "You gave more than you ever got." They paused at the end of the block, where an old street pole still held a rusted bracket, once used to hang a film poster. Keanu reached into his coat and pulled out his phone. "Stand there for a second," he said. Harlan stepped beneath the bracket. Keanu took a photo. In the background, the pawn shop's old lettering still lingered faintly on the bricks. But above Harlan's head, on the rusted sign holder, Keanu saw something else. The echo of what used to be. "One night only, Harlan West." As they continued walking, the city around them hummed with its usual rhythm. Horns, footsteps, murmured conversations. But for Keanu and Harlan, it all felt distant, like background music to a memory still playing itself out. They passed an old diner that had been renovated into a smoothie bar. Harlan glanced through the window at the bright lights and digital menus. "Used to get black coffee and burnt toast in there for $1, he muttered. "Now it's kale and oat milk." Keanu chuckled. "You ever try oat milk?" "I barely trust tap water," Harlan replied, a faint grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. They kept walking, turning onto a quieter side street. The buildings were older here, untouched by the relentless renovation of Midtown. The city's skin was thinner on this block, its history still visible in the cracked concrete and faded signage. Harlan stopped suddenly, looking across the street. "That's the place," he said. Keanu followed his gaze. A small brownstone, once converted into a micro-cinema in the 80s. It had hosted midnight screenings, indie films, and art house projects. Keanu recognized it immediately. This was where he'd first heard of Monarchs of Dust. Not from a billboard or a magazine, but from a flyer taped to a lamppost. Harlan stood still, hands in his pockets. "They used to hand out popcorn in brown paper bags," he said. "Some nights we didn't have more than 10 people. But every seat felt full." Keanu nodded slowly. "That's what it felt like last night." They crossed the street together. The brownstone was boarded up now. Dust coated the windows, but carved into the side near the doorframe, barely legible, were a few scratched initials. Stared in shock. "H.W." Harlan reached out and ran his fingers across them. "I carved that opening night," he said, "back when I thought my name would outlive the walls." Keanu stepped beside him. "It did. You just didn't know where." For a moment, Harlan didn't answer. Then he said, "I think I spent so many years surviving that I forgot what it felt like to be remembered for something beautiful. Not scandal, not silence, but something honest." Keanu rested a hand on the railing beside them. "You were never gone, Harlan. The world just didn't know where to look." They stood there, facing the forgotten theater and the initials carved in stone. Two men stitched together by time, story, and quiet defiance. Eventually, Harlan turned away. "I don't want to be mourned," he said. "I want to be mirrored." Keanu looked at him. "You already are. In her." He didn't have to say the name. Harlan knew. They made their way back toward the main street, the morning sun finally breaking through the clouds and casting long shadows behind them. Harlan walked a little slower now, not from exhaustion, but as if trying to hold on to every second of the city that had once forgotten him. When they reached the edge of the block, Keanu pulled out his phone once more and looked down at the photo he'd taken earlier. Harlan beneath the rusted bracket, the ghost of the marquee still echoing in the background. He showed it to Harlan. "You should frame it," Keanu said. "Proof that legends don't fade, they just change locations." Harlan chuckled, looking at the screen. "If you told me a week ago I'd be standing here again, I'd have called you delusional." Keanu pocketed the phone. "If I told you a little girl would draw your face under a spotlight and call it her beginning," Harlan's eyes softened, "I'd have called that a miracle." They walked in silence for a moment, then Harlan added, almost to himself, "I think I'm ready for what comes next." Keanu smiled. "You already wrote the next scene." 3 days after the performance, something unexpected began to ripple across the internet. Not with flash, not with celebrity tags, but with quiet reverence. A young filmmaker named Jordan Lyle had been seated in the back row of the theater that night. She was 23, barely out of film school, and had heard about the show through a whispered tip from her mentor. She had shown up with a notebook, and low expectations. She left, changed. Without telling anyone, she had filmed a short segment on her phone. Not the whole performance, just 2 minutes from the janitor's chair. It wasn't for profit or promotion. She'd captured it because something about the way Harlan sat in silence before speaking had struck her. 3 days later, she posted the clip. No title, no tags, just the caption, "He never stopped performing." The first 100 views came from her followers, mostly other filmmakers and art students. The next 1,000 came from strangers. Then the clip appeared on acting forums, then Twitter. Then a casting director in Los Angeles reposted it with the comment, "Who is this man? Why am I crying at 2 a.m.?" Within 24 hours, it had over 500,000 views. The comments rolled in fast. "I remember him. That's Harlan West. I saw him on stage in '89. He made me believe actors could be poets. Is this a new film? No? Why does it feel more honest than anything I've seen all year? This man saved me once. He taught at my correctional facility when I was 17. I never forgot his voice." Some asked where they could find more of his work. Others begged for the full performance. Many just sat in the comment section, not saying much at all, just reacting with quiet awe. But one thing became clear. People hadn't forgotten Harlan. They just hadn't seen him in a while. Keanu saw the video the same morning it passed 750,000 views. He didn't post about it, didn't share it. He just watched it, standing in his kitchen, hands in his pockets. The clip was simple. Shaky phone footage, theater shadows, no enhancements. But it hit him like the first time he'd seen Harlan on screen all those years ago. He let the clip loop twice before locking his phone and putting it face down. No need to speak. The work spoke for itself. He didn't call Harlan right away. Something told him the man already knew. Later that afternoon, Keanu stopped by the Brooklyn theater where it had all begun. He found Harlan in the same back hallway, mop in hand, whistling something soft and unrecognizable. The floor was half-finished, the bucket sloshing gently with each movement. He didn't look up when Keanu entered. He didn't need to. "You've seen it?" Keanu asked. Harlan kept mopping. "I've seen a lot of things lately. Be more specific." Keanu chuckled. "The clip. From the show." "Oh," Harlan said, finally pausing. "That." He set the mop against the wall and leaned back slightly, hands on his hips. "My neighbor's daughter came banging on my door this morning screaming, 'You're on TikTok.' Thought maybe she was having a stroke." Keanu grinned. "It's gone viral." "I figured," Harlan said, voice casual. "Someone at the corner deli asked if I used to be a movie star. I told them, no, I still mop floors." Keanu leaned against the doorway. "And yet the internet has discovered your fire." Harlan shook his head, bemused. "I didn't light a fire. I just whispered in the dark. Ace heard you." There was a long pause. Harlan reached for a rag and began wiping down the baseboard. "You worried I'm going to lose myself in it?" he asked. "No," Keanu replied. "I think you're the only one who won't." Harlan smiled faintly. "Good, because this?" He gestured to the hallway. "This is still my stage." Keanu stepped closer. "Until the next one." Harlan raised an eyebrow. "You think there'll be a next?" "I know there will be," Keanu said. "You showed up for yourself. And now, the world is showing up for you." Harlan went quiet again, eyes fixed on a small scuff mark near the wall. He rubbed it slowly with the cloth, the motion deliberate, like each movement helped settle the truth inside him. "I don't want a second act," he said quietly. Keanu tilted his head. "Why not?" "Because this isn't a comeback. It's a continuation. Same voice, same soul, just no curtain this time." Keanu nodded, his voice almost a whisper. "You're not performing anymore. You're remembering, and they're remembering with me." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Harlan picked up the mop and returned to the far end of the hallway. The silence between them felt full, not of things unsaid, but of things deeply understood. Keanu watched him work, each stroke as intentional as his words on stage. And for the first time in a long time, the rhythm of cleaning and the rhythm of storytelling felt exactly the same. Before Keanu left the theater, he took one last glance down the hallway. Harlan was finishing the floor, working his way backward toward the door, mop gliding smoothly with each step. He didn't look like a man who had just become a viral sensation. He looked like a man who still believed in doing things completely, even if no one watched. Keanu called out gently, "You know they're going to keep asking. For interviews, for more shows, for answers." Harlan paused, standing still with the mop in hand. "I'll let the words speak," he said. "And when I have something new to say, I'll say it." Keanu smiled. "That's more than enough." They exchanged a small nod. Nothing theatrical, just two men sharing quiet certainty. Then Keanu turned and walked out, leaving Harlan to finish the hallway. Outside, the noise of the city returned, but softer somehow. The world kept moving. But it was different now. A voice once silenced had been heard, and it wasn't done speaking. A week after the performance, Keanu stood in the back office of a small Los Angeles print shop, overseeing the final touches on a custom frame. Inside it, behind non-glare glass, was the poster from A Night with Harlan West. Simple black text on white paper. No production company, no sponsors, no photos. Just the name. And beneath it, the quote Harlan had opened with. "They said I disappeared, but I was only ever quiet." Keanu held the frame carefully, making sure the matting was centered and the wood smooth along the edges. Then he wrote a short note and folded it into an envelope. It wasn't addressed to Harlan. It was headed to Northern Pine Correctional Facility, the state prison where Harlan had once taught acting classes for inmates. A few days later, the package arrived. The warden, a broad-shouldered woman named Carla Mendoza, opened it in her office. She read the letter once, twice, then carried the frame through the main corridor to the prison library. She didn't make a speech, she just hung it on the wall above the media shelf and walked away. That afternoon, a handful of inmates filtered in for their regular study session. One of them, a tall, quiet man in his 40s, stopped cold when he saw the frame. He stared at it for a long time. Another inmate noticed and asked, "You okay?" The man nodded slowly. "That was my teacher," he whispered. "He told me I wasn't broken, just waiting for my scene." Word spread fast through the facility. That night, a group of men crowded around the corner computer station, watching the viral video of the janitor's chair with headphones passed from hand to hand. Some nodded. Others wiped their eyes and didn't say a word. For many of them, it was the first time they'd seen someone who had once stood in the same space they now occupied rise to be seen again. Not with bravado, not with power, but with purpose. The clip didn't feel like a performance to them. It felt like a message carved from the same silence they carried every day. Back in New York, Keanu returned to the Brooklyn Theater late one evening, hoping to share the news with Harlan. He brought a copy of the photo he'd taken under the rusted marquee and a list of messages sent by former inmates who had written in after seeing the video. But when he stepped inside, the hallway was empty. No mop, no bucket, no echo of footsteps. Keanu walked down the familiar corridor, pausing when he reached the usual corner where Harlan always left his gear. There was no sign of movement, only a single folded note taped to the mop handle. Keanu peeled the note from the mop handle with steady hands. The handwriting was unmistakably Harlan's, neat, deliberate, a little faded from age, but clear as ever. It read, "On to teach. Same stage. New scene." Keanu stood there in silence, the mop leaning gently beside him like an old friend left behind. He read the note again, then folded it carefully and slid it into his jacket pocket. He didn't feel sadness, not exactly. It was something softer, something peaceful. He looked around the hallway. The floor had been freshly mopped, the lines still drying, everything in order. Even in his exit, Harlan had finished the job. Keanu wandered into the main theater, the one where Harlan had first rehearsed at night with no audience but the air itself. The stage was dark, the chair was gone, but the memory of that night, of Harlan in the spotlight, was still etched into the boards. Keanu sat in the back row and stayed for a while, letting the quiet speak. He thought about the prisons, the schools, the empty rooms Harlan would now walk into. He'd carry no spotlight with him, no viral video crew, just his voice, and a willingness to give it away again. And people would listen, not because he was famous, but because he was true. That was legacy, not trophies, not press, but the ripple of a single voice carrying forward long after the performance ended. Outside, the sky had turned to a soft blue dusk. Keanu left the building and walked down the block. At a coffee shop nearby, someone had taped a printed still from the viral clip to their window. A man sitting in a chair, a soft spotlight. No name, just the caption. He never stopped. Keanu smiled and kept walking. That evening, he called Carla Mendoza at Northern Pine Correctional. "Thank you for putting up the frame," he said. She replied, "You don't have to thank me. I had 3 inmates come to the library today and ask if we still had a drama program." "Do you?" "Not yet," she said, "but we will." Before hanging up, she added, "One of them said, if Harlan could come back from silence, maybe I can come back from this." Keanu said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, "That's what he always wanted." When he hung up the phone, he looked again at the photo from under the marquee. The image of Harlan, standing where his name used to shine. It didn't need to shine anymore. It had already lit the next path. 2 weeks later, Keanu received a letter in the mail. It was from a small community center in upstate New York. Inside was a photo, Harlan standing in front of a makeshift classroom with 6 young men seated on folding chairs. A whiteboard behind him had one word written in block letters, "Voice." The note was short, just a few lines in familiar handwriting. "They don't clap, they ask questions. It's better this way. Tell Lila she gave me courage." Tuesday, June. Keanu placed the letter beside the framed sketch on his desk, the one Lila had given to Harlan, and later redrawn just for Keanu. He looked at the 2 pieces side by side. 2. A message from a child who found her voice. The other, from a man who never lost his. And between them, a legacy. Not built on stages, but in quiet rooms where truth was spoken, heard, and passed on. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, hand resting over both messages. Then he whispered, to no one and to everyone, "The next scene's yours now." Keanu climbed the narrow stairs to Harlan's walk-up apartment on a cool Wednesday morning. The building was quiet, its wooden railings worn smooth by decades of tenants. He reached the 3rd floor, knocked twice, and waited. The door creaked open. Harlan stood in the doorway with a duffel bag already half-zipped at his feet. "You're early," he said with a small grin. "You're packed," Keanu replied, stepping inside. The apartment was modest. 1 window, 1 lamp, and a bookshelf leaning slightly to the left. The furniture was sparse, the walls nearly bare, except for 1 framed photograph of a dusty theater stage and a clipping from an old playbill thumbtacked above the kitchen sink. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Harlan turned back to the bag, folding a soft, worn scarf into the top layer. "Arizona doesn't need much. Sun handles everything." "You sure about this gig?" Keanu asked, setting down the small box he'd brought. "Just snacks and some books he thought Harlan might want for the road." Harlan nodded. "It's a juvenile center outside Phoenix, the kind with cement walls and plastic chairs, and kids who already think they're too late." Keanu sat down on the edge of the couch. "Sounds familiar." "Ended last week," Harlan said. "Said they watched the video in a staff meeting. Asked if I'd consider visiting. I said no. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Harlan grinned. Then I called back 5 minutes later and said yes. He walked to the shelf and pulled down 3 books, a thin copy of King Lear, a collection of personal essays, and a dog-eared notebook filled with handwritten monologues. He laid them on top of the scarf in the duffel bag. No costumes, no curtain, just a circle of folding chairs, he said. That's enough. Keanu nodded slowly, watching the ritual with quiet reverence. What else are you taking? He asked. Harlan reached into the drawer near his bed and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. He handed it to Keanu. It was the sketch. Lila's drawing. The beam of light, the chair, the words. He never stopped. This, Harlan said softly. This goes with me. He placed it carefully inside the notebook and zipped the bag closed halfway. Don't need much, he added, just a reason. Keanu stood and walked over to the bookshelf. His hand brushed past a stack of old playbills and paused on a thick, cracked script wedged between 2 hardcovers. He pulled it out and turned it over slowly. Monarchs of Dust, final draft. He looked at Harlan. Harlan just smiled. It's yours now. Keanu turned the script over in his hands like it was a sacred object. The cover was creased and soft at the edges, the pages yellowed with age and covered in tiny pencil marks. Stage notes, rewrites, timing cues. Some margins were filled with thoughts scrawled in haste. Others with whole lines, crossed out or underlined 3 times. He opened the first scene. The handwriting in the corner read, Delmar enters. Don't blink. Keanu smiled faintly. You kept everything? Harlan shrugged. Didn't have much else to keep. That script followed me through 6 apartments, 3 buses, and 1 very nosy customs officer. Keanu sat back down and flipped a few more pages. Whammy? He asked quietly. Why give it to me? Harlan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes soft. 'Cause you never stopped asking why. Even when the world told you to move on. That's the only kind of person who should carry it. Keanu stared down at the script. I memorized this monologue when I was 17, he said, pointing to a scene near the middle. Recited it in a mirror with a flashlight taped to a broomstick. Harlan chuckled. Bet you did it better than I did. No, Keanu said. But I tried to mean it. That's what mattered. They sat in quiet for a few moments. Then Keanu carefully closed the script and placed it back on the table. What are you going to teach them in Arizona? He asked. Whatever they're willing to hear, Harlan said. Monologues, breath control. Maybe even a little Shakespeare if they don't throw chairs at me. Keanu laughed softly. But really, Harlan continued, I want to show them that their story isn't over. That you can start again from anywhere. Even from silence. He walked over to the bag and zipped it the rest of the way. You don't need a spotlight to be seen, he said. You just need to stop hiding. Keanu looked at him, then back at the bookshelf. You sure you're not forgetting anything? Harlan thought for a moment, then walked to the counter and picked up a battered cassette tape in a plastic case. It was unlabeled. He turned it over in his hand and offered it to Keanu. Last rehearsal of Monarchs recorded on a boombox, he said. One of the stagehands did it without asking. I never listened to it. Bill. Keanu accepted the tape like it might fall apart in his palm. Were you not? Harlan's eyes twinkled, because the only performance that mattered came after. The taxi arrived just as the sun was breaking through the early haze outside. Harlan slung the duffel over his shoulder, not with struggle, but with ease, the kind of lightness that comes from carrying only what matters. Keanu walked with them to the curb. The driver loaded the bag in silence, sensing something more sacred than luggage had just been handed over. Before Harlan climbed in, he turned to Keanu. If they ask about me, tell them I left the spotlight where I found it. Keanu nodded slowly. And where's that? Harlan smiled. In the hands of someone who'll use it right. He stepped into the cab, gave a wave, and disappeared down the street. The city rising around him like a set, being struck after a closing show. Keanu stood there for a while, the script under his arm, the cassette in his coat pocket, and Lila's second drawing folded neatly in his wallet. He looked up at the morning sky. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a passing of the torch. And this time it was wrapped in memory. Not fame, just story. Duism, just truth. The drive took nearly 4 hours. Keanu kept the windows cracked and the radio off. The cassette Harlan had given him rested on the passenger seat. He hadn't played it yet. He wasn't ready. Some memories deserved silence. Some memories asked to breathe without being spoken. The old film set for Monarchs of Dust sat at the edge of a forgotten desert town. Half ghost town, half failed movie ranch. It had once been a project full of promise, a studio's dream of building its own western/backlot for dramas, epics, and period pieces. But the funding dried up, and only one film had been shot there. Harlan's film. What remained now was dust and decay. Keanu pulled off the road and parked just outside the warped wooden gate. The archway still bore the faded, peeling letters, Kingdom Lot. He stepped out, script in hand, and walked slowly past the creaking fence posts. Inside, the palace was still standing, just barely. 2 stone columns, chipped and overgrown with weeds. A wooden throne set, sun-bleached and cracked. Everything was dry and crumbling, the desert reclaiming what the camera had once tried to immortalize. Keanu stepped into the open courtyard and stood still. This was where Harlan had delivered the monologue, where he had looked into a cracked mirror and said, "I am dust, but I remember the thunder." Keanu walked over to the broken bench beneath the archway, brushed off a layer of sand, and sat. He opened the script slowly, flipping through the worn pages until he found the scene. He cleared his throat softly, then read aloud. Dabley used to bow when I entered a room. His voice was quiet, but it carried. The wind paused for just a moment, as if waiting. Now the wind barely remembers my name. He stopped, looked up. The set was empty, but the air felt full. He kept reading. I mistook silence for peace, and shadows for loyalty. Each line came slower than the last, not because he didn't know them, but because he felt them now in a way he hadn't before, as if every word had aged alongside the actor who first spoke them. Keanu finished the monologue, then let the silence return. He looked around. It wasn't a stage anymore, not really, just a shell, a frame around something that once mattered, and still did. He reached into his bag and pulled out the script. He closed it gently, smoothed the cover, and set it down on the bench beside him. Just in case someone came. Just in case someone needed it. Then he stood and looked around the courtyard one last time, as the wind kicked up a soft swirl of dust. Keanu stepped away from the bench, walking slowly toward what remained of the throne platform. The wood groaned beneath his feet, but held. From here, the view was wide, miles of flat desert stretching out toward the horizon. No cameras, no crew, just the sound of his own breath, and the occasional rustle of sand against the old set. He stood still for a moment, imagining Harlan in costume, his robe billowing from a cheap fan just off-screen, his voice cutting through this same dry air like a blade. He could almost hear the director whispering, "Action." Could almost see the focus puller adjusting lens rings by instinct. But those days were gone. The lens was memory now. A soft bark broke the quiet. Keanu turned. A boy had wandered into the lot from the far trail, maybe 10 years old, holding a leash attached to a shaggy tan mutt with a lopsided grin. The boy looked confused, curious but not afraid. He walked carefully across the brittle set boards, stopping when he saw Keanu standing at the center. "What is this place?" the boy asked. Keanu smiled gently. "Used to be a movie set." The boy's eyes widened. "Like a real one?" "Yeah," Keanu said. "A long time ago." The boy looked around, eyes full of wonder. "What movie?" Keanu stepped down from the platform and walked back to the bench. He picked up the script and handed it to the boy. "It was called Monarchs of Dust," he said. "Not many people saw it." The boy opened it carefully, thumbing through the pages. His fingers paused on a scene with a line that read, "The world forgets kings faster than it buries them." "Is this real?" he asked. "It was," Keanu said. "And maybe it still is, depending on who reads it next." The boy nodded, then looked back toward the trail. "My grandpa watches old movies every night," he said. "He says they don't make them like they used to." Keanu smiled again. "Your grandpa might be right." The boy turned to leave, then paused. "Can I take this?" Keanu gestured to the script. "It's yours now. Just promise me something." The boy looked up. "Don't just read it," Keanu said. "Say it. Out loud. Let it live." The boy nodded, clutching the script to his chest. Then he gave a quiet thanks and started walking back toward the trail, dog trotting ahead, tail wagging, script tucked under one arm like it held treasure. Keanu watched him until he was gone. The wind blew gently across the set, and the dust remembered everything. Keanu stood alone now, the sun lowering just enough to cast long shadows across the sand. The air had a stillness to it that only came after something had passed, not ended, but moved on. He walked back toward his car, not in a hurry, letting the silence settle around him. Before opening the door, he turned once more toward the set. It was broken. It was beautiful, and it had done its job. As he reached for the door handle, he looked down at the passenger seat. The cassette Harlan had given him was still there. He picked it up, turned it over in his fingers, and smiled. Not today. He slipped it into the glove compartment and closed it gently. This wasn't a day for echoes. This was a day for planting something new. Back at the bench, the dust danced quietly around the empty seat where the script had been. In its place, only sunlight now. But it had been passed. To a boy. To a voice. To a future scene not yet written. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real performance. The world forgot Harlan West. The headlines never called his name. The critics didn't remember the films, and the theaters, one by one, folded his story into silence. But I didn't forget. I remembered the first time I saw his face flicker on a screen, saying words that broke something open in me, not because they were loud, but because they were true. I remembered how he stood on a stage decades later, with nothing but a chair and a light, and somehow it felt like watching the earth speak. He never asked for fame. He never wanted pity. He wanted only to be heard. And for a long time, no one listened. But then a young girl did, and that changed everything. She listened, not with applause, not with noise, but with attention. And because she did, his voice kept going. She stood on her own stage, said his words, gave them breath, gave them legs, and he stood in the hallway, cane in hand, watching her carry something he once thought had been lost to time. That's legacy. Not statues, not trophies. Just one soul, passing the thread to another. I watched Lila grow, I watched her audition, I watched her choose not to perform but to mean it. And I knew then the story would live because it had found a new voice. Not louder, just braver. We like to think greatness is loud, that it shines, that it shouts. But Harlan taught me something different. Greatness waits. It listens. It shows up when no one's clapping. It speaks when the room is empty. It writes when no one's looking. And it keeps going, even when the lights go out. He used to mop floors after the shows. I remember the sound of the bucket wheels echoing through the back hallway. The way he'd look at the stage when it was dark, like it was still sacred. That was his church. Not the fame, not the flesh. Just the place where a voice could speak, even if it was the only one listening. I kept a cassette he gave me. I haven't played it yet. Maybe one day I will. Or maybe I'll leave it where someone else can find it. like he left the chair, like he left the words. A man who taught from silence. A man who taught by standing still. A man who never really left. Because now she speaks, and she listens, and one day someone will ask her where she found her voice. And maybe she'll say, it started with a man no one remembered. But she did. And I did. And now, neither will she. I still visit that old theater sometimes, not because I expect to see Harlan on stage, but because the air remembers. The walls remember. The floorboards still carry the weight of his footsteps, and the corners still echo lines spoken when no one else was around. There's a chair left under the spotlight. No plaque, no sign, just a chair. It faces the audience even when the seats are empty. And when I sit in the back row and close my eyes, I can still hear his voice. Not booming, not polished, just clear. I am not here to be remembered. I am here to remember who I am. That line still gets me, because now I see it everywhere. In the girl who speaks quietly but with purpose. In the man who listens more than he talks. In the teacher who waits for the silence to make space before saying something that matters. Harlan was never chasing glory. He was chasing truth. And he caught it, not when people clapped, but when someone else picked up the thread. Legacy isn't what we leave behind. It's what walks away from us still breathing. So, to whoever finds this story next, tell it again, your way, but carry the stillness too. And if ever you feel like your voice doesn't matter, remember this. He once performed to no one, and it changed everything, because someone heard it eventually. I did. She did. Maybe now, you will too. Have you ever met someone whose quiet strength changed your life? Tell us in the comments. Their name deserves to be remembered. And what story should we tell next about forgotten legends? Let us know. Maybe their truth is waiting to speak again.